Well, hello to all of our leadership and members all across two great countries. Welcome to the kitchen table. We're all working remote today, as is basically almost everyone in the country, except all of you that are continuing to be on the front lines each and every day, still responding to your communities and to the needs of our citizens. And I know the entire nation is proud of your work, but certainly your union recognizes your commitment and your service. And we want to make sure that we are responding to you. And this kitchen table is going to be focused on assisting our leadership at the local level. But first, I want to make sure that you recognize that this IAFF has been focused on this current pandemic since January, when we first began to put our protocols together, our guidance together, the information together to provide to all of our affiliate leadership and our membership across the United States and Canada. I know we're all aware that we had our first experience, our members had their first exposures to COVID-19 in Washington State in February, back on February 28th. And following that, our incredible staff, who although working remote, is continuing to do the work on your behalf, providing the services, resources, tools, and the information that's so critical right now during this health care crisis. They're working with CDC and NIOSH, FEMA, HHS, all to make sure that we are on the front line on your behalf. But today, as we hold this kitchen table, we thought it would be of importance and information needed by those of you that are leading our affiliates all across the IAFF. I know you're faced with requirements for local union meetings and state conventions, provincial conventions. And so we thought we'd have a discussion today on some of the legal issues that you may be facing and trying to decide how to continue the work on behalf of your union and still remain consistent with the Constitution, your Constitution, and any relevant laws that come into play. So I'm really pleased to have with us today as our guest, our General Counsel, Doug Steele, who leads a legal team on behalf of the IAFF and on behalf of you. And so Doug, I want to welcome you to the show.
Good morning, thank you.
Doug, I think the first thing that I'd like to have you speak to is maybe some of the responsibilities of our local affiliate leadership regarding local needs. I know there are many constitution and bylaw mandates. I know that this does impact state and local operations. And so taking into account the Constitution and your knowledge of many of our affiliate constitutions, as well as any relevant law, why don't you speak to the focus and responsibilities during this crisis that our local affiliates should be thinking about and trying to follow?
Sure, we've been getting a lot of inquiries because local unions have mandatory meetings or regular meetings set forth in their constitution and bylaws that are coming up over the next few months. In many jurisdictions, of course, even holding a meeting like that is prohibited because of social distancing requirements and provisions. So this creates a real dilemma for the local union on how to manage their constitution and bylaws without violating the certain health issues that require separation. The first two things to consider, I think, one is what kind of meeting is it? Is it a regular union meeting or an election meeting? And we'll get into the election stuff a bit later in more detail. The other thing I would guess to keep in mind is local autonomy. The way the IAFF is structured, of course, is based on local autonomy, and pursuant to the international constitution and bylaws, it's the local affiliate president who has the primary responsibility for interpreting the local constitution and bylaws, including in matters of parliamentary procedure, which all are at play here. So, first and foremost, this really is a judgment on how to proceed that will be made at the local level.
And Doug, and you also mentioned elections, and that's really a very important issue for all of our affiliates. I know their constitutions require them to hold elections. There's notice requirements. The question really is, in this very unique moment where we are trying to work, as I am today from home and as you are today, how do we advise our affiliate leaders, taking into account their constitutional requirements and potentially any labor department requirements? How do we advise them to go forward with their elections? Can they do it electronically? Can they do it telephonically? What advice do we have for our affiliate leaders concerning elections?
This is probably the trickiest situation the affiliate leaders are facing with respect to the current environment, because there's a lot of different things that come into play. First, of course, the international constitution and bylaws requires that officer elections be secret ballot elections. And that is going to put some constraints on how you proceed, whether it's an electronic meeting or some other fashion. So that requirement needs to be kept in mind. Secondly, you have the local constitution and bylaws, which may have some very specific provisions on nominations and how they're held and when they're held. That's all going to impact what type of meeting you need and how to go about dealing with holding an election during this time. U.S. Department of Labor regulations are applicable to this situation, and not just in the United States, but in Canada as well. And the reason is because the international represents private sector as well as public sector employees. Any delegates to the international convention have to be elected in accordance with U.S. Department of Labor requirements. Now, the Department of Labor has started to examine the COVID-19 situation, understanding that it's going to have implications for local union elections. According to the laws and regulations that get applied to local affiliates, local leaders have to be elected no less than once every 3 years. So there is a time frame in which the federal law provides you have to hold the local election. Many locals won't be able to meet that because of COVID-19. And so what the Department of Labor did is they issued some advice, and they said, we don't have authority to change the law on that, but what we are going to do is adopt a non-enforcement policy. So if a local election is pushed beyond the 3-year limit, the Department of Labor will not enforce the law against the local, provided that they take reasonable steps to hold an election when they're able to.
Okay, well, we're talking about elections, we're talking about local union meetings. Why don't we shift for a moment and talk about our state and provincial affiliates and their conventions. Of course, this is just the beginning of traditionally the season for our state and provinces to hold their conventions. And in turn, not only handling the business of a convention, but in many cases, the elections that occur for state and provincial officers. And so what kind of advice can we give? What is the law as it relates to many have already postponed their events? I think a few have canceled, but can we give any additional guidance as it relates to the states that between now and probably June 1, I guess we're all listening to the various guidance coming out daily. And the last that I heard this morning was that certainly through the month of April, but now they're talking about possibly up till as late as June 1 to keep in place the social distancing and non-gathering of groups. So with that said, what advice do we have for our state and our provincial bodies?
With respect to state and provincial bodies, in some ways it's more complicated, in some ways it's a little bit less complicated than for local affiliates. And what I mean by that is that the delegates from state and local conventions to our international convention do need to be elected by secret ballot. That's pursuant to our Constitution and bylaws. But they are not voting delegates at the convention. They don't vote for international officers. And because of that, there's a little more leeway in how a state or provincial affiliate might handle an election. Again, they have to start with what's in their Constitution and bylaws, which is usually going to be pretty firm. Now, you want to find out whether your Constitution and bylaws has any procedural limitations in it or procedural power that it gives the association on dealing with meetings. And just one example, and this is a very large state association, but I reviewed their Constitution and bylaws on Friday. And they specifically have a provision that said for their convention that if there is not quorum for the convention, if they don't have enough locals at the convention, they're to simply adjourn the convention to a specified date in the future. And so that handles the procedural requirements. It meets the requirements of their Constitution and bylaws, but it allows them to, reflect the fact that the local leaders aren't going to be able to come in from all over the state to hold the convention as intended, but there is this procedural mechanism that locals can use and affiliates can use to effectively hold the meeting and immediately adjourn it to a later date. And with state associations, one of the reasons why they probably need to look at that effort is for a lot of them, their nominations come from the floor of the convention. So it's not as simple as holding this convention via video conference call. Now, there is one provincial association that is trying that. They are not electing officers this time, so they don't have the secret ballot requirement, but they've decided that they're going to set up video hookups at each local that's a member of the provincial association and allow participation that way. I think for in most cases, we're going to see delays, postponements in the convention. And what they need to keep in mind if you're doing that is you can't ignore your Constitution and bylaws requirements on when the elections to take place. You can't just unilaterally, the executive board, say, we're not going to hold this local election. We're not going to hold this convention at that time. But procedurally, you hold the meeting, you don't have quorum, and then you adjourn it to a date in the future. And adopting that procedure, you do want to make sure that because of the crisis, you actually do not have quorum showing up. And that's probably not going to be an issue with COVID-19, but you have to kind of go through that process.
Well, let me ask you this then, Doug. Is there a way that elections could be held remotely? And if so, then what is your position on electronic voting? I know we've had a lot of discussion about electronic voting unrelated to this current pandemic. So just your thoughts about the Labor Department currently and what our advice is for the possibility of online voting?
Yeah, right now, what our advice is for online voting, even in this crisis, is don't do it. And the reason is the US Department of Labor has never found an online voting system to meet federal labor law requirements. Among the requirements that you have to have under federal law is that the candidates get to observe the voting process. You have election observers, which really doesn't work if you're doing online voting. And just as important, according to the Department of Labor and the courts, the election observer has a right to, witness and monitor the tabulation, which is again something that you're not going to be able to do through online voting. However, there are some options that would be available. And one is to do a mail ballot election. Mail ballot elections are perfectly permissible if they're handled in the right way. It's to maintain the secret ballot sanctity. But you could do a mail ballot election without bringing everyone together. In another circumstance, affiliate that contacted me said that for their nominations, they're working through the process on how to deal with a nomination meeting electronically, but they said as far as the vote, they use ballot boxes. And so they can arrange the ballot boxes, which are in different locations, to make sure that their members keep proper distance from one another when they approach the ballot box. And so they intended still to use a secret ballot box election. So there are different options that are available depending on what you're trying to do. For electronic meetings, which is the related issue that comes up, the most important thing to keep in mind, aside from elections, is that every member has a voice and vote at the meeting. And what that means, if you're going to do a meeting electronically, whether it's state or local, the setup has to allow the local members or the state association delegates not only to see everything that's going on, but to participate in the debate. They have to be seen, they have to be heard, and everyone has to be able to hear what's going on, so it's a proper and full debate. There are a lot of systems out there available now that do that, but you just need to keep in mind that the requirement of giving everybody a voice and vote has to be considered. On voting, the other thing I would say is that the strict rules apply to the election of union officers. You can use electronic voting for other things: contract ratification, shop steward election. If you have other votes that are not electing delegates to the international convention, then you may be able to use an alternate online voting mechanism if you use one that still provides for a secret ballot. So there are options for those types of elections.
Well, these are certainly unique and historic times, and this is one series of questions and area of interest that I know our leadership has and will be faced with dealing with. And but let me just close this segment off by first making sure that all of you out there know that your executive board and our incredible staff are doing terrific work. They're not missing a beat. They continue to provide the support and assistance out to our affiliates while working with our governments and making sure that we are focused on the issues that are impacting our members' lives and livelihoods. And so, Doug, I want to thank you for joining the kitchen table today. And I know through our vice presidents, our affiliates may have questions that they will be sent to your office and to your legal team, and we will stand ready to handle them individually as they come in. Hopefully all of you out there have found this kitchen table to be of some assistance, And more important than anything else, stay safe out there.